Welcome to the Trailblazers. I'm Perry Rarick, your host and chief editor of Follow Your Buyer. The purpose of this interview series is to share with you interesting discussions I have with trailblazing thought leaders. They're thought-provoking, they're innovative, they challenge the status quo, and they serve as vanguards for positive transformation. My guest today is Vasudha Khandeparkar, and she certainly lives up to every bit of that description. She's a highly skilled data professional with extensive experience in data and analytics strategy across a number of industry sectors, including retail, finance, marketing, and hospitality. She builds strong analytical teams, and she develops and employs innovative predictive marketing tools. She's passionate about helping organizations learn how to use data to drive strategy and analyze customer behavioral data to calculate growth potential and company valuation. She strongly believes that customers and data should be at the center of business decisions and all efforts to communicate innovation. And she's with us today. Welcome, Vasudha.
Hi, Perry. Thank you for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
Well, we're excited to have you. I'm very excited about this. I've been looking forward to it for some time. So I'm guessing I'm going back into my memory. About 15 years ago, I was at a biopharmaceutical trade show in the United States on the West Coast. It was the last day of the event. And I ran into a gentleman who was a recruiter, an HR recruiter, representing one of his clients in a biopharmaceutical company. And he was looking for somebody who had dual degrees and experience in biology and computer science. And he was very unhappy because he hadn't found anybody. He was very low on this final day of the show. And he described the need that this biopharmaceutical client that he had was sitting on what he referred to as big data. And he waved his arms, big data. He said they needed to organize it, sort it, protect it, and then use it to try to make better decisions. And something tells me we have come a long way since then. So I thought it might be helpful if we could start out. You've been at the ground floor of all of this. Could you just give us a history lesson about data analytics and what it is and what are we doing today with it?
I think firstly, the challenges that you mentioned that your colleague has in terms of, the data has been collected, but you still need to make sense of it. There's no point in having a whole library if you're not going to read the books. And this is very much the same. You've got all of this information. If you're not going to use it, how does that drive you any value? But what's interesting is you had this conversation 15 years ago, but for me, data analytics in its true form, where it really sort of hit it big almost, I'd say would be around sort of the Second World War, where we really got out of the theoretical zone into application. There's still theories, there are scenarios that are written about that time period, which are still used. I still use them today. And I think the most common example, everyone's heard of the code breakers at Bletchley Park. But I think for me, the one example that stuck out was something that, an American mathematician called Abraham Wald did. And he was looking at the damage patterns on aircraft that came back. So these are the ones that were actually, that went into the war zones, had all the, engaged and then came back. And obviously they lost some planes along the way as well. So the operations people were trying to figure out what they needed to do to make sure that they could get more of their aircrafts and people back. And they kept looking at the damage patterns on the planes that came back, and they kept reinforcing the damaged areas. Wald comes in and he says, hang on, this is the damage, but these planes came back. What about the ones that didn't come back? What about the areas where this plane doesn't have damage? Maybe this one came back because, the areas that are already reinforced were the only ones that got attacked. The rest of them are perfectly fine. And that's when they kind of switched gears and they started reinforcing the areas that didn't have any damage in the aircraft that came back. And they had a significant change in terms of their efficiency and their effectiveness. And for me, that kind of captures what data is about. They had the data and they didn't have some of the data, but then they were able to kind of put the two together and sort it out in a manner that allowed them to make a decision that eventually helped them, win the war. And I think for me that kind of captures the spirit of what everybody's trying to do with data, which is you've got the information in front of you. How do you make sense of it? How do you put other things into the equation and then make sure that what you bring out of it is something that you can actually use?
It's, I had a feeling you were going to take me way back in history, and I knew that this didn't start 15 years ago. So, thanks for that clarity. So what are we doing now? So technology. So we're not counting holes in aircraft as much.
Yeah.
So what are we doing now? How are we employing this?
So I think in terms of technology, yes, the innovations happened and it's happened in stages. So the first stage of innovation that happened was, what the volume of data that's coming out, because we're using more, technology systems, the volume of data that's coming out is steadily increasing. We've got applications that we engage with, we've got websites that we engage with. Even from the time we wake up in the morning, we set our alarm on our phones to the time we sort of get into the car to get to work. The amount of data that we generate is just humongous. So a lot of the innovation, as the data analytics and allied fields kicked off, the first thing that kind of came into the equation was how do we capture this volume of information? Because unless we can capture it, unless we can store it, we can't do anything about it. We can't do anything with it. We can't generate value. So a lot of the early innovations, so 90s, 2000s, was more about, okay, generating and then collecting that data. Then the focus kind of shifted. It's how do we develop new systems to be able to analyze, work with that data, interrogate that data so that we can start making sense. Then in the past sort of a decade and a half almost, you've been seeing a lot of dashboard visualization, that type of software coming in. So you can see the data that you're working with. In the past sort of 5-10 years, there's a lot of software that's come in that's gone, hang on, all of the innovation that's happened up until this point has required you to have a certain level of technical knowledge. So you need to be able to write code, you need to be able to interact with the data in a very specified technical way. But now what's happening is data in itself is being more democratized. Of course, there's the generative AI applications, which are the extreme end of democratization. But even if you look at companies these days, a lot of businesses are using tools which allow you to interrogate the data, just drag and drop a lot of different modules and sort of work with that data very easily. And I think that sort of shift, we know this is there, we're going to make it much easier for us to use it. That's where it's shifting to. How do we make it much easier for any enterprise to use the data that they already have? And everyone has data. I know there is the concept of big data, but if you again go back to the theoretical roots, there's a very small number of rows of data that you actually need in order to make a good decision. Even if you look at pharmaceutical data, the number of patients that are required for clinical studies aren't as large as the volumes that people sometimes think are needed. So it kind of goes back to that. What you have is enough. You don't need to sort of have all of these fancy systems. You don't need to have fancy fancy tools. What you have, every single person probably has the tools at their fingertips to be able to analyze and work with the data that they want to work with.
You make it sound so easy. I on any given day, I feel overwhelmed with data, the information that's coming to me. I rarely think about myself as a generator of data. That's an interesting point that you make out. We're all generating this data. And certainly we're going to talk a little bit more about marketing, customer and buyer behavioral data, but we're all generating data as well. That's that. Wow. That's really, but the lights came on there for a bit. The one thing you mentioned is, for lack of another word, I'm going to refer to it as a user interface. Our ability to interact with the data is becoming more user friendly. And I assume that that's been accelerated at an accelerated pace, and it's going to improve over time.
Absolutely. I think the thing is, once you make one part of this entire value chain easier, the rest of it almost follows. So if it's easier for me to interrogate the data, the more I'm going to then start sharing that data. So then your visualization tools become easier. The more people see it, the more they ask questions. So the entire kind of loop almost innovates on itself, which has been amazing to see, because when I started off, there weren't as many sort of fancy tools. There wasn't the ability to work with that volume of data. And now the amount of data that I can go, I'm like, yeah, that's fine. Don't worry. Just, just send it across, and that's perfectly fine. And I've seen the other end, hey, we don't have that much. We've only got this. Can you work with this? And it's amazing to see the amount that you can do with what you've got in front of you today.
Incredible. So I'm going to go back to where we started with the aircraft analysis. And, initially, the problem solvers were looking at the wrong data,
Yeah.
which were the holes in the aircraft that survived. It caused them, it forced them to look at, well, wait a minute, who didn't make it back? And let's look at that data. And so there's got to be like an art and to finding the right data, focusing on the right data. Can you speak a little bit about that?
I think in terms of the data that everyone collects, like we've already touched on the fact everyone generates data, everyone consumes that data, because it's, there is that interaction pathway. But as sort of a person who's analyzing the data, working with that data, the first step is whatever you get in is very messy, it's very dirty. It's almost, think about it as moving house. When you move house, it's messy. You've got boxes, you've got tape, you've got packing material everywhere. Before you actually kind of get settled and start thinking about, okay, which picture goes on which wall, you need to clean everything. So data is the same. You get the data in, it's moved multiple places, from the person who generated the data to whoever's captured it to whoever's actually sent it to you. So it's already moved a lot of places. So it's the same thing. You have to clean it first. You get it into a format that's actually, useful, right? So you go, fine, I need this, I'm going to clean it. Once you clean it, you realize, okay, hang on, I've got 10,000 rows, I don't need all of them. I can work with half that, so you get that useful set of information. Then you need to think about, okay, how do I make this usable? So I'm going to use it. You've already gone from 10 to 5, you've made it usable, right? It's much easier to deal with. You can play with that data set in many different ways. Now, what a lot of people miss even today, coming even from that aircraft example, is how do you make it usable? So in that aircraft example, it was useful information. The damage points was useful information. But in terms of the usability and how they used it, they kind of went, okay, I have to reinforce this to make sure more aircrafts come back. But the missing data, the key data, was what about the ones that didn't come back? And I think in today's business world, particularly, that missing piece of information is the context. So what are you intending to do with this information? Yes, I can tell you and I can provide you with all of the information around what's happened, customers are interacting with you, how, what else your competitors are doing, what is best of breed, what is, best in class, whether you build it, whether you kind of, adopt something that's there outside. But how are you going to use it? It's much easier because you have this vast array of tools and you have an even larger array of data that you can use. It becomes extremely important to determine why you're using that information. What are you going to do with it? Because then it becomes much easier to make sure that the output that you built is useful. It's actually useful to make the decision that they're trying to make. And then you kind of can work backwards as well and start, going with, okay, how much data do I actually need? What sources do I need to consider? If I don't get access to something, how do I then cover for that? So what are the gaps that I need to cover for? And what you kind of slowly realize is, by doing that, you know exactly what you need, where you need to get it from, and how you can kind of tell the whole story together.
So I've heard this a lot. It's very important to identify the outcome, what you want to do with the data before you start, maybe not collecting it, but certainly looking into it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. Yeah, because everyone's collecting data, whether you know it or not, everybody's collecting data. And I'm not talking about when, and again, I think the confusion comes because people think when you collect data, it's these fancy kind of cloud servers or databases that are sat somewhere, and they're collecting this vast mountain of information that you see in the movies. Everyone's got data. I mean, open up your laptop, you'll have a bunch of stuff sat in Excel files and Word documents. All of that is data. So everybody's got access to the data. If you're a student or if you're, anyone who's trying to understand something, there's publicly available information today that's free to access. And so it's all there. It's what are you going to do with it? It's all there for you to make decisions with. How do you want to use it? What is the decision that you're trying to make?
So you emphasized the effective use of data is understanding what is seeking what you don't know, and so having a good outcome. So how do you know that something's missing? So we had a smart guy at the airfield in the UK who figured out, well, wait a minute, let's look at the aircraft that aren't coming back.
Yeah.
So how does that happen? How do you go about, and how do you coach people to do that? Go back and check that outcome and look for the missing data.
I think in today's world, again, going back to the tool set that we've got available, experimentation is a lot easier. So I don't have to make decisions in the absolute. I can always go, this is what I'm thinking. So the scientific approach to how you're doing something works. Again, if we go back to the house moving example, you've got a painting, you put it up and you go, actually, that doesn't quite fit in this wall. I want to try it on this wall. You don't go putting the nail in, hanging the painting up, and then deciding that, hang on, this isn't the right wall for it. And that's the same approach to when you work with data. So when you kind of reach a conclusion, again, you could be missing data. And one of the examples that comes to mind is I had a project that I worked on for a client previously, and they were looking at the performance of their email campaigns and the buyer behavior post the campaign. And what they realized is at some point at night, they had a lot of abandoned baskets. And they were like, okay, why is this happening? This is out of the ordinary. It doesn't usually happen all of the other time. And it was a very specific time window. And they realized it was only happening to one segment of customers. So they did a lot of things. They tried to send more offers, which had some level of impact, but it still didn't fix the problem at the window. And the solution came to me literally that night because that was the window when I was putting my own kids to bed. And I went, yeah, hang on, you know what? I've kissed you goodnight, I've tucked you in, and then I'm going to go and do something. But then you've woken up because you thought the curtains were scaring you. So it's not me actually abandoning the purchase because I'm hoping you'll send me an offer, but it's me abandoning the purchase because I have to go take care of the monsters in the curtains. And it's that kind of nuance, that kind of thinking that you kind of need to bring into the equation. And I think it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort to put two and two together. I think Target had a lovely example about 20 odd years ago where where they were looking at purchase behaviors for their customers, and they realized that when you sort of start in your you stop buying certain kinds of products. And they use that to then start predicting whether or not their female buyers were pregnant. And they actually found out that some of their customers were pregnant even before the customers found out that they were pregnant, which obviously didn't work out very well. But that's the kind of thing. So what is it that's missing? What are you going to use it for? And it's when you're faced with data, there's only going to be a certain volume that you've got access to. So the question of what am I missing always needs to be at the back of your mind.
You're really making this world that I find so complicated understandable, very understandable. So thank you for that. I'm speaking with Vasudha Khandeparkar, and she is a data analytics and artificial intelligence expert. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to be back with her in a moment. Hi, Hi, welcome back to the Trailblazers. I'm speaking to Vasudha Khandeparkar. She is an expert in data analytics and AI, and she has just opened my eyes and simplified this very complex world for me. And we talked about the importance, Vasudha, of making sure before you jump into the data and start sorting it and getting into all of that, make sure you have an outcome in mind, something that you want to find out or discover, or some action you want to take, and then use the data. So important to remember those two things. Now, I would say most people want to use data to make better decisions. I remember talking to a lot of people when they first got involved in data analytics, like, well, we want to make better business decisions, or we want to understand in the terms of marketing, understand what our customers are doing, where they are in the buyer's journey. But that seems to be a really difficult aspect of this, but that's the outcome they want. So why is it so difficult?
I think there's a couple of reasons. And one of them, I think the primary one is that people only often see the swan song. So you see what's happened, you see the whiz bang, the big stuff that's happened. And you often miss the fact that, it's not happened overnight. It's taken a lot of time and effort to get to a stage where companies can say, oh, I'm data driven. And what happens over there is often the key thing that everybody misses when they see all of these, big bang, this is how we use data, is around the context. So how did they get started? What did they start with? What was the set that they started with? What are the pieces of data? What are the pieces of information that they collected? How did they use it? How did they make sure that they transformed, a useful data set into something that was actually usable? And how did they ensure that every single decision that was made off the back of that data set was also tracked? Because data can't work in isolation. You have to have that continuous feedback loop. So that context of, okay, you know what, somebody's done something great with say an AI tool. How did they start off? Did they first, even the basic qualitative building blocks? So do they know whether they have the right systems in place to be able to do that? Do they have the right governance protocols? Are they sure their customers are going to be okay with it? What is the data then that they're going to expose to the tool? How are their customers comfortable sharing the data with the tool? How is the data being processed then? So how is the data interacting with the system? Is the system understanding the data correctly? Is the system making incorrect assumptions about the data? Then you start going, then you start looking at the trends. These are the trends that are coming out. What is this telling me about my customers? What is the context? Am I trying to understand when they come to my website? Am I trying to understand how much time it takes for them to first browse, then look at something, and then buy? Am I trying to understand why they're browsing something? I mean, there's a lot of people that look at, say, very expensive watches or very, really amazing. Yeah, they're interested in it. But if you're thinking about it from, say, a buyer's perspective or a customer's perspective, there's only a very small proportion of them that are actually going to convert from I'm going to configure my new Ferrari to I'm actually going to hit the order button. So it's understanding that nuance. That's where a lot of qualitative data around customer behavior, which often gets ignored, comes into the equation. So it's the quantitative. So the quantitative is much easier to collect, much easier to analyze and make decisions from. But the qualitative data, so understanding mindsets, understanding behaviors, understanding the psychology of people, that often kind of gets missed as well. So when you start putting both of that together, and when you work with a set of stakeholders who often understand their customer better than the analyst looking at the data does, when you put that kind of a team together, the team that works closely communicates, then you get these outcomes which we then start reading about, which is, oh, look at how much these guys are using data, and these are the types of decisions they're driving. This is the amount of money that they've made as a result of using that data. But what doesn't come across is the layers and layers of information, the iterations of algorithms that have gone into sort of building up to that crescendo.
We're speaking far less about the technology and far more about the human interface with it and making just common sense decisions. You mentioned context. That's something that we have to bring to the table. So I find myself being influenced by data. So I may jump into the data with some outcome in mind, but then I start
Yes.
looking at it and I drift. Is that
Yeah.
common? Is that a common problem?
I think it is because the volume of information that you're faced with is so vast. So how do you know? And one is you say you drift, but that's in my mind, that's a good thing because when I look at a data set, I'm almost going, what else is connected to this? What else could be influencing this? Why could this be happening? And that, as you said, makes me drift. So I'm going, okay, why does this happen? Let me try and figure out something's been going on at that time, or if there was. So I still remember when I was doing something for a grocery chain, we found that there was suddenly a spike, and there were instances when they actually ran out of certain products in some of their stores, and that was like just an anomaly, hadn't happened before. And we would look back 2 years, which is what we did. Then we did 5 years, we did even longer, and we're like, what is going on? This has never happened. How did we get stocking so wrong? And all of that. And then what we realized was it was even when we looked at parameters in isolation, right? So the weather was hot, yeah, but it's never happened on the hottest day last year. That's fine. What we realized was the Olympics were on, and it wasn't even the Olympics were on, and it was the hottest day, and these were the stores where they had tourist hotels at the best prices. So that's the reason why it was just that specific set of stores that had a lot of stockouts. And it's not so if we looked at each line item in isolation, weather, yep, that's fine, not a problem. If we looked at tourist season, not a problem. If we looked at Olympic delta, not a problem. But suddenly you put everything together, you then start getting an answer out of it. So it's always the fact that the drifting, at least in the data world, is not a bad thing. What you need to keep in mind is that, even if you drift, you follow the curvy road, but you're still going towards the target that you're trying to hit. So at least in the world of analytics, I would say drift away.
Okay, you've given me permission. I don't feel bad about it anymore. So in the business to business space, and what I'm closest to, the pharmaceutical industry. So B2B pharmaceutical folks are solution providers, are offering services and goods, products to help drug developers advance a therapy. It's a long process. It's complex. There are a lot of people involved, um, and it can take a year or more as
Yeah,
somebody tries to find a solution that's best for them.
yeah,
That's a lot of data being generated by that buying group. And if I'm hearing you right, there you have to have a little patience, I think, to look at that data and kind of connect the dots as to what's going on. Huh?
yeah. And I think, and you're right, it takes time. Because there is a volume of data, but depending on the infrastructure that you have in place, it could be, it could happen very quickly, or it could take some more time. And then as you said, you start other questions start coming into your mind. What else is kind of causing an impact? Then you have to go back to almost step one, collect that information, collect that data, that entire pipeline before you get a set of data in front of you that you think covers everything, is clean enough to analyze, doesn't have those extremities, doesn't have anomalies in it that you can't explain, or you explain away. All of that takes a good 60 to 70% of a typical analytics project. And people kind of tend to ignore the fact that just working with that data, dealing with of time, again, going back to that house moving example, it's if you move from one house, a standard sort of one bedroom to another one bedroom, it's still a huge change. You don't unpack all of your luggage overnight. You don't dispose of all of the trash overnight. It takes you a few weeks, sometimes even more than that, to sort of really settle in, make it feel like your own kind of comfortable space. And that's very much the same with data. It doesn't take you, sometimes it can take weeks and months to kind of collect data, depending on how complex it is. And for a pharma company, if you think about it, there's then you go, okay, I'm confident enough to say even send this to a clinical trial. Clinical trials have a length of time that they have to function over. They've also got other parameters, geography concerns, to make sure that they're looking at the entire, they're considering all types of individuals. So it takes time. And I think with anything, in order to get to that perfect outcome, it takes time. But if you need to start, but the thing is, the time that you invest as well is not sort of a lost investment. Once you've worked with the data set, you know what the issues are, you know what is there. It's much easier to do it the second time round. The third time round becomes much easier. And I think that's something that's important to consider as well. Yes, you're making the investment, but it's something that will generate return for you, but it takes time. And even when I think the key mistakes that I've seen across businesses as well is when they onboard data teams, you hope that there is this person with a magic wand and his whole bunch of tools that's going to come in and suddenly make money for you. It takes a typical data team anywhere from 12 to 18 months to start showing how much value they can drive. Now, I know it seems like a really long time, but if you think about the volume of data that exists, sometimes it's just not in the right place. It makes sense. You can kind of have that sooner, but data infrastructures and everything, if you really want them to start becoming income generating for you, so really show you how they can save you money, how they can drive other efficiencies, and really start bringing the money in, that is definitely 12 to 18 months. So it's not that to see an output or see a report's going to take you 12 to 18 months, but to really start realizing the value starts only after the 12 to 18-month period, because they need to speak to everybody in the business, from HR to operations to your sales guys. They need to speak to everyone. So by the time they actually finish that, they get that context, they get the understanding. It takes time. And I think that's something that businesses often tend to ignore, irrespective of the level at which you bring a data person in. It takes time. It takes time to actually see that value generation. And 12 to 18, like I said, is average. It can happen much quicker when you've got the infrastructure already in place and someone who knows exactly how to work with it. That's a match made in heaven, and the magic wand starts appearing. But it's not the case across the board. That's a very small proportion of unicorns that you can find, and that happens. But for everyone else, just give it time, but keep at it, because it's very easy to, everyone says if you want to exercise and you want to keep exercising and make it a habit, you need to do it continuously for anywhere from 30 to 90 days. So give the data guys at least that 30 to 90 days is what I'd say.
What valuable viewpoints you're bringing to us. This is really good. So one of the things I often run into, which isn't good behavior, is as soon as somebody, we're generating data, collecting data. A lot of times that data tells you, okay, here's a person, here's some contact information, send it to sales, and then sales jumps right on it without
Yes.
doing all of the smart things that you're talking about. So if somebody does that, and let's say they have some wins, I'm gonna refer to it as, is it worthwhile doing a win analysis? So, okay, wow, we got a sale. Let's go backwards and see how this happened. Well, one, can it be done? And is it valuable?
I think it is. So I know that the context that you mentioned was very much, human agent kind of doing the interaction. But one of the things that, sort of comes to mind is when we were working with another sort of, of an F&B provider essentially. And what they were looking at is they had huge sale volumes from all of their campaigns over, the festive period in December. And that was their busiest campaign. Everything is good, self-explanatory. But for an analyst, you almost go with, what, that's the best playground almost that you've got, isn't it? Whatever you do, you're not really going to make much of, you can't, you've got a large volume of information because it's an F&B provider that people are buying with. So it's a large volume of data. You've got all types covered, you've got everything in there. But when we looked at that data, what we realized is there was a whole bunch of redundant contacts. So actually, the next time round, we sent about 20, 30% fewer emails out. Revenue went up. Revenue for that campaign actually went up because what we were doing is because we had a definitive number, we were able to tighten up the contacts that we were actually sending them to, and going with, you know what, here you go. These are the guys that need 10%. These are the guys that can be, pushed at 20%. These are the guys that need something slightly more. These are the guys that just need, maybe an extra box of chocolates. That actually then allowed them to make a lot more money. So you sent fewer contacts out, but you got a lot more revenue out of it. So you can be a lot more deliberate. So even if that person made a sale, what is the price at which they made a sale? Did they need to, did they need to offer it at that price? Could they have made 10% more? So every single data point is valuable. But again, I go back to context. So you made a sale, it's all well and good. Do you want to analyze it? What are you going to get out of it? Why are you analyzing it? Are you trying to find more prospects like that you want to speak to? Are you trying to make sure how you make these agents more effective? Are you having an issue with conversion and you're trying to figure out how to, what are the variables that impact conversion? So that context is very important again, because if you know why you're analyzing that value chain, it's again much easier to justify to the rest of your business stakeholders, but it's also then more focused because this is a win pipeline. You know that your analyst, you know that your business is then focused on solving the problem that you see in that value chain rather than just leaving it as it's a good journey. Why do we need to do it? And it also protects you from that bias. So it protects you from the bias of if we always have these people, we always get a sale and it's all well and good.
Remarkable. This is you just make this sound so easy. This is great. I want to transition. AI, everybody's talking about AI. They're turning jobs over to AI. I think we're learning a lot about how to use it
Yeah.
as a tool. A lot of advice coming from folks like you who have experience with it. So, what's AI's role in everything you're talking about? Can you speak a little bit about that?
I think AI's role is again pushing that data democratization frontier for me. At least that's how I look at it. So, what it does is it makes a lot of this complex analysis, complex interaction with data a lot simpler for people. And what it does is you can give it a micro problem and it solves it for you. So, what AI is really good at doing is solving a specific problem. So, all of the stuff that you see today, AI is solving that one specific problem. It still hasn't gotten to the Minority Report levels of, everything singing and dancing, but it solves those very, very specific problems. And so what it's done is it's not just solving specific problems, it's made it much easier for everybody to access the solution as well as access a way to solving that problem. And I think that's what makes it amazing. And I think it's something that's really, really nice to see. But I think at the same time, it depends on that human interaction, which is why I think all through whatever comes out of AI, whatever comes out of everything, the thing that a human can do, which is look at a set of problems and then optimize the solutions to the set of problems, that's something that AI can't do today. So again, the human actually becomes even more important. It's again the human deciding which set of problems or which specific problem am I going to direct this AI tool to.
So it certainly has limitations. So what are some of the problems that, like, if you're not thinking like you do about AI, what are some of the things you might run into?
So there's AI, all of the tools that exist today depend on the volume of data that you've got accessible. So whether you're a business or whether you're using the open source sort of AI tools, all of it depends on a set of information that's available. Now, you as a human are thinking as we've talked about, when you're analyzing a set of data, you get distracted, right? AI gets distracted as well. But what AI does is it's eager to please. It wants to give you an answer. It may not have the data at the back end, but it wants to give you an answer. So, one of the most important things is the guardrails that you put around the usage of AI. And one of the most important guardrails is around something that we see a lot around hallucination. Because AI wants to please, what it does is it makes up a set of information. There are multiple times when I've said, hey, can you give me a report by this company that shows or talks about this topic, and it will give me it will pull up a lovely little quote for me and do everything. Hey, can you send me the link to that paper or that article? And more often than not, that link, even though it looks real, will be a dummy link. That link won't exist. And so that becomes important. And there's obviously, I always talk about kind of the 4 Ps when I'm speaking to anyone. I'm like, what is, again, the purpose that you're doing it for? You need to make sure that you've got the guardrails, the information that AI is using is validated, it's valid, you can access it, you can check it as well. It's not at the level where we can just trust it blindly. Then what is, sort of protection? So how, and that kind of feeds into protection. So how are you protecting yourself? And how are you protecting your customers, your business in this entire equation? And then it goes into privacy. So you need to protect them, you need to keep some of that information private. How are you doing that? How are you putting that governance in place? And then the people, your people who work in your business potentially know the business a lot better. They know their job, they know how the company is interacting with the customers, they know how they're interacting with each other. How are your people coming to this equation? When you kind of consider these 4 key aspects, I think you cover for a lot of the issues that AI have. AI can't play those tricks on you with like fake made up data as easily as it can if you're not asking it. You're not asking it to validate. I mean, all of us have seen the reels and the memes around how you can convince a tool that 1 + 1 is 5. But it comes back to making it's not 5. How are you going to make sure that you whatever other output you're getting is not the equivalent of 1 + 1 is 5?
So AI is a pleaser, and so if it over pleases, you have to send it to counseling to figure out what's going on there.
Why it's a people pleaser.
So you said AI hallucinates. How does that happen? How can that happen?
It what it essentially does is AI looks at the information at hand and it puts two and two together, right? And what happens is it makes clever assumptions about how to arrive at 2 + 2. So if you think about how it creates a sentence, say it knows when someone says at the park, it assumes that the word that comes after the is usually, at is usually the. So it will put that in. Now, take that up a level into concepts. So where you've got sets of words that now go in together, that happens. So now it knows, actually, if I look at company A, they publish this type of document, and that usually talks about this. This is the language that they use, this is the URL that they use, and this is, how they publish it. This is what the URL looks like. So it's the same thing. I know that when I'm referring to company A, I put that into the URL. Then I need to have whatever report is usually called, or whether it's a blog or an article, and then I make up the rest of it. Now, how companies usually work is they own the URL. So when you click on it, it takes you to a website that then no longer exists because it's a fake website. And so that paper or that topic or that article doesn't exist. So it's the way in which it's built. It's not it you need to make sure that it's looking at information that exists. And again, a lot of the information that some of these large tools have access to are hidden behind paywalls. So it's not that easy to go access, validate, and verify that information. And that's where the guardrails and the protection, how are you protecting your business against this? So are you going to rely on this tool and the outputs completely? Or are you going to just use it for a specific, you can use it, it's very good at saying, giving you a benchmark for something that you don't have idea about. But then in terms of, say, if you're actually going to put money against it, to start sort of chipping away at it and making sure that it's got the level and the depth of research and analysis that kind of goes into it to validate that number. But in terms of getting to a ballpark, in terms of doing something, it's great. But how do you then make sure that's actually valid? How can you make sure that this tool isn't just going all over the place and giving you information that doesn't exist?
I act that way too, like AI. If I've seen something before and I'm hearing it the same way, I start making assumptions, and I could be wrong if I assume too quickly or don't listen closely enough. That's amazing. So the importance of guardrails. There always has to be a check on the backside of whatever you have AI doing for you.
Yeah. I think so, and I think it's extremely important because we kind of come into this world where, to an extent, you can also automate a lot of decisions. You can rely on AI to make those decisions for you. How are you convincing your colleagues, the customers, that the decision that you're making is right for them? So again, it's not just about keeping data at the heart of the business, but keeping customers, and it's not just external customers, it's your internal customers as well. How are you making sure that they are at the heart of the decision? Do you understand the output? Are you convinced about the output enough to be able to communicate it to them? We know we generate data, but we're getting some value out of it. So when we put our email address down, or when we share our phone number, we know that we're getting some value in exchange for that. How are you making sure that you are relaying that to your customers? So yes, I am going to use AI tools with the data that you've given me, but this is the value I'm going to provide. And this isn't just for, when we say customer, we typically think about your paying customers, the ones who, sort of engage with the business, but your internal customers as well. How can you show them the value of, they could have used any one of the freely available AI tools to come up with a ballpark answer to the question that they've asked you. How do you make sure you actually give them the value that they're looking for, and how do you convince them that that value is actually validated and it is correct?
That's great. Just phenomenal. I'm guessing a good amount of the business world is not doing what you're talking about. Okay. They have no data analytics strategy. Nothing this is being employed. I still talk to a lot of people who use spreadsheets, and they look at them manually and sort them using some of the, Excel formulas and things like that. But that's about as far as they're going. So if somebody is at that stage and they're thinking, wow, I really like what Vasudha is talking about, I want some of that. All right. What advice would you have? How do they get started?
My first question again would be context. Okay, so you're already analyzing a lot of this information. What do you want to do with it? What are you hoping to do with it? Right. So if you're say you're a company, say let's pick an industry. Let's say you're an F&B provider and you have all of your lease information on a spreadsheet. What do you want to employ analytics for? Do you want to employ it to tell you, hey, your leases are expiring here, you need to go have a renegotiation with the landlord, or the rent that you're paying is actually much more than the rent that that your neighbors are paying in that region. You need to again go renegotiate with the landlord. What is it that you're using it for? If you're say going to use it for rent negotiation because everybody else is paying 10% lower, then how are you going to make sure you build that that data pipeline? Where is the data available? How are you going to make sure you get the data from the land registry equivalent of where you are? How do you connect the two together? And again, Excel's Microsoft, because they're now slowly moving to a different infrastructure, where originally it relied on what was on your laptop or what was on your desktop. Because of cloud infrastructure coming into the equation, you can actually kind of build all of these connections. Yes, it'll be slow because that's not what Excel's made for, but you can still do it. If speed isn't the parameter that you're trying to optimize for, and you're trying to solve for this, rent negotiation problem, then actually you can kind of build it out in Excel. There's a whole bunch of formulas that you can do. So for me, it's always, you've got a set of tools, you've got a set of data. How are you going to solve the problem? And like I said, any analytics team takes 12 to 18 months. How do you get them, if you're going to get that analyst in, hey, make our lives a bit easier, start showing the fact that, value that you can generate, because if you come in greenfield, it takes a lot longer. So how are you slowly kind of chipping away at the larger problem? It's never going to be big bang. It's always a set of small things that you do that then allow you to do that. Excel is good enough for these individual decisions, but when your data set starts getting larger, or when you have to do two things together, hang on, rents have gone down and my lease is up for renewal, now I need both together. And actually, the space is too small. I need a larger space. Go 3 decisions. When more decisions start coming in, that's when it kind of starts making sense investing in sort of larger infrastructure, which is what large businesses see. But if you're a small business owner, for example, you can do a lot with the tools that you've actually got available. You don't need to invest much more than, some of your time.
Remarkable. It's this is such a good conversation. I'm really, really enjoying this. Thank you very much, Vasudha, for being with me today. So Vasudha Khandeparkar has been my guest today. She is a data analytics and AI director at Grant Thornton in the UAE, and she helps companies build strong analytical teams. She develops and employs predictive marketing tools. She helps them analyze customer behavioral data to calculate growth and valuation. And it's just remarkable the way you speak about this. And you've done a great job of simplifying the complex. If somebody would like to contact you and get your help, how can they do that?
So reach out to me. Email's probably the best way. I'm most responsive in email. My email address is my first name.k@ae.gt.com. If you look for me in the Grant Thornton UAE website, you can get hold of my details. So in case you didn't grab that, then just go to the GT UAE website and you'll find all of my details there.
Wonderful. Thank you for being with me today, Vasudha.
Thank you, Perry, for having me. It was an absolute pleasure having this conversation with you.